I never used to believe that children could see the world differently from adults. I always thought that was just something people said to romanticize childhood. That changed when I started working as an elementary school teacher. Specifically, it changed when I met one student who, through his drawings, showed me a side of the world I had never wanted to see. It was my second year teaching second grade. I had a class of 22 students, all the usual mix of energy, curiosity, and mischief. Among them was a quiet boy named Tommy. He was the kind of kid who easily went unnoticed in a classroom, a bit too small for his age, with pale skin, messy brown hair, and these big dark eyes that always seemed to be watching something just over your shoulder. Tommy never spoke much. He wasn't disruptive, didn't cause trouble, but he also didn't participate in class discussions. He did his work, kept to himself, and sat alone during recess. There was something about his silence that bothered me, but I had no reason to press him too hard. Until the day he turned in his art project. We had been working on a unit about families. The assignment was simple: draw a picture of your family. Most of the kids drew the usual stick figures: mom, dad, themselves, maybe a sibling or a pet. Tommy, though, handed in something different. His drawing was detailed. It was done in black crayon, with lines so dark and dense that the paper had nearly torn in some places. In the center was a figure that was unmistakably him. He was surrounded by taller figures, presumably his family, but their faces were obscured by thick, swirling lines. The house they stood in front of was also dark, with heavy, jagged lines that made it look like it was collapsing in on itself. And hovering above them, nearly blending into the dark sky, was a shape that made my skin crawl. It looked like a person, but distorted. Its limbs were long and thin, almost like branches, and its head was tilted at an unnatural angle. The face, if it had one, was hidden by more of those heavy, swirling lines. "Tommy, can you tell me about your drawing?" I asked him gently. He stared at the paper for a long moment before looking up at me. "That's my family," he said quietly. "And who is this?" I pointed to the figure above them. Tommy hesitated. His dark eyes flicked up to mine, and then he whispered, "That's who comes at night." A chill ran down my spine, but I forced a smile. "What do you mean, who comes at night?" He didn't answer. Instead, he just shrugged and looked away, as if the conversation was over. I didn't want to push him, so I let it go, but I couldn't stop thinking about that drawing. Over the next few weeks, I started paying more attention to Tommy. I noticed how he always seemed tired, with dark circles under his eyes. He often nodded off in class, and when I asked if everything was okay at home, he would just nod and mumble, "I'm fine." But his drawings told a different story. Every art project we did, Tommy's work would feature that same shadowy figure. Whether it was a picture of his house, the playground, or even just a random scene from his imagination, the figure was always there. Sometimes it was far in the background, barely visible. Other times it was right in the center, looming over everything else. The other kids started to notice too, and would whisper and giggle about it, but Tommy never seemed to care. It got to the point where I couldn't ignore it anymore. I decided to call his parents in for a meeting. When his mother came to the school, she looked as tired as Tommy did, worn out, with the same dark circles under her eyes. I showed her the drawings and asked if everything was okay at home. She stared at the pictures for a long time, her face pale, before finally shaking her head. "It's nothing," she said, but her voice was unconvincing. "Tommy just has a vivid imagination. He's always been like that." I didn't believe her, but there wasn't much more I could do. I suggested that she might want to talk to someone, maybe a counselor, but she just nodded absently and left. A few days later, Tommy didn't come to school. I called home, but there was no answer. He was absent the next day too, and the day after that. By the end of the week, I was really worried. I contacted the school administration, who eventually reached out to the police. When they went to Tommy's house, they found it empty. His mother, his father, and Tommy himself were all gone. The police said there was no sign of a struggle, nothing to suggest they had left in a hurry. It was like they had just vanished. The only thing left behind was Tommy's room. Inside, they found his bed neatly made, his toys scattered as if he had just been playing with them, and a stack of drawings on his desk. The drawings were more of the same black crayon, swirling lines, that shadowy figure. But the last one was different. It was of Tommy's house. The figures of his parents were there, standing in the doorway, but Tommy wasn't with them. Instead, he was in the sky, being carried away by the shadowy figure, its long, branch-like arms wrapped around him as they disappeared into the darkness. I don't know what happened to Tommy. The police never found them, and eventually the case went cold. But I can't stop thinking about those drawings, about what Tommy said. That's who comes at night. I still teach, but I'm more careful now. I pay attention to my students, to the details in their drawings, to the things they don't say, because sometimes children see things that we can't, and sometimes those things are real. Whatever it was that took Tommy, I hope I never see it. But sometimes, late at night, when I'm alone in my apartment, I'll catch a glimpse of a shadow out of the corner of my eye, and I'll wonder if it's watching me too. As a child psychologist, I've always believed in the power of children's drawings to express what they can't say with words. I've seen it all: happy scenes of families, scribbles of imagined monsters, and everything in between. But one case changed the way I look at those drawings forever. It wasn't a monster or a dark, shadowy figure that haunted me. It was a little girl and what she showed me, through her innocent sketches, about the very real danger she was in. Her name was Emily, a sweet 7-year-old with blonde pigtails and bright blue eyes. She came to me through a referral from her school after she began having trouble in class. She'd always been a good student, her teacher told me, but in recent weeks she had become withdrawn and distracted. Her grades had started to slip, and she wasn't interacting with the other kids like she used to. The teacher thought it might be due to the fact that Emily's parents were going through a messy divorce, so she suggested counseling. Emily was shy at first, barely speaking during our initial sessions, but I was patient. I knew it would take time for her to open up. Instead of pressing her to talk, I encouraged her to draw, a technique I often used with young children. I provided her with a stack of paper and a box of crayons, letting her doodle whatever came to mind while we chatted. At first, her drawings were what you'd expect: a house with a pointed roof, a sun in the corner, a smiling stick figure family. But as our sessions went on, the drawings began to change. They became darker, not in color but in content. The smiling figures disappeared, replaced by people with blank expressions, standing far apart from each other. The sun vanished from the sky, leaving the scenes shadowy and cold. One day, Emily drew something that made my blood run cold. It was a picture of a girl sitting alone in a small, dark room. The girl's face was turned away, but there was something about her posture, hunched over, arms wrapped around her knees, that radiated fear. I asked Emily to tell me about the picture. "That's me," she said quietly. "Why are you alone in that room?" I asked, trying to keep my voice calm. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she started drawing again, adding more details to the scene: a window with bars on it, a heavy door with a lock. My heart began to race as I realized what she was showing me. "Emily, where is this room?" I asked gently. She hesitated, then whispered, "It's the basement." I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. "Your basement? At home?" She nodded, her eyes fixed on the drawing. "Mommy puts me there when I'm bad." I forced myself to stay composed. "How often does this happen?" "Sometimes a lot," she said. "Sometimes not at all." I had to suppress the surge of anger and protectiveness that welled up inside me. I knew I needed to tread carefully, to gather as much information as I could without scaring her. "What do you do when you're in the basement?" "Nothing," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I just sit there." I asked a few more gentle questions, trying to get a clearer picture, but Emily had already retreated back into her shell. She spent the rest of the session drawing quietly, her face expressionless. That night, I couldn't sleep. Emily's drawing haunted me. The image of that little girl alone in the dark, locked away by the person who was supposed to love her unconditionally. I knew I had to do something, but I also knew that making an accusation like this without concrete evidence could have serious consequences. The next day, I made the difficult decision to contact Child Protective Services. I provided them with my notes, Emily's drawings, and the details of our conversations. I knew it was the right thing to do, but that didn't make it any easier. I couldn't stop thinking about what Emily might be going through while the investigation was taking place. A few weeks later, I received a call from CPS. They had visited Emily's home, but the mother had been cooperative, denying everything and insisting that Emily was a troubled child who made up stories. The basement, they said, was just a storage area, cluttered but harmless. They found no physical evidence to support Emily's claims. I felt a deep sense of frustration and helplessness. Without any proof, there was nothing more I could do. Emily continued to come to our sessions, but her drawings remained dark, and she never spoke about the basement again. It was as if she had given up, resigned to her fate. Then one day, Emily didn't show up for her appointment. I called her mother, but there was no answer. The next day, I tried again, but still nothing. After a week with no word, I contacted the school, only to be told that Emily had been withdrawn. Her mother had decided to homeschool her. My heart sank. I had failed her. I had seen the signs, I had known something was terribly wrong, and yet I hadn't been able to protect her. Months went by, and I tried to move on, but Emily never left my thoughts. Then, almost a year later, I got a call from the police. Emily had been found. Her mother had been arrested after a neighbor reported hearing a child crying from the basement. When the police arrived, they found Emily locked in a small, windowless room, just as she had drawn it. She was malnourished, frightened, but alive. The mother had been using the basement as a punishment for any minor infraction, sometimes leaving Emily there for days. The relief I felt was overwhelming, but it was tinged with guilt. Emily had tried to tell me, in the only way she knew how, and I hadn't been able to save her sooner. She was placed in foster care, and I was allowed to visit her. When I saw her again, she looked thinner, paler, but there was a spark of hope in her eyes that hadn't been there before. "Do you want to draw today?" I asked her gently. She nodded, and I handed her a blank sheet of paper and some crayons. For the first time in a long time, she drew a picture of a house with a pointed roof, a sun in the corner, and a smiling stick figure girl standing in the yard. This time, the door to the house was wide open, and the basement was nowhere to be seen. I never imagined that a simple after-school art program could lead to something so dark, something that would haunt me long after I had locked the classroom doors for the last time. It was supposed to be a fun and creative space for kids to express themselves, a place where they could paint, draw, and let their imaginations run wild. But one of those kids, a boy named Liam, used his drawings to show me a truth I wish I had never uncovered. Liam was a quiet, lanky 9-year-old with a shock of black hair that always seemed to fall into his eyes. He was one of the kids who always stayed late, working on his projects long after the other students had packed up and gone home. He wasn't a particularly talented artist, but he was diligent, focused in a way that most 9-year-olds aren't. The program ran for a couple of hours after school, Monday through Thursday. Most of the kids were there because their parents worked late and needed a safe place for them to stay. Liam was no different, except that unlike the others, his mother never seemed to be in much of a hurry to pick him up. She was always the last parent to arrive, often looking distracted or stressed. I didn't think much of it at first. People have their own struggles, and I wasn't one to judge. But as the weeks went by, I noticed something odd about Liam's drawings. They were all very similar, simple sketches of a house, always from the same angle, with a tree on one side and a swing set on the other. The house was plain, just a boxy shape with windows and a door. But there was something about the way he drew it that caught my attention. It was the window on the second floor. Liam always drew it with thick, dark lines, heavier than the rest of the picture. Sometimes he would scribble over the window until it was almost completely blacked out, as if he was trying to hide something inside. One Thursday afternoon, as the other kids were gathering their things to leave, I walked over to Liam's table. He was working on another one of those house drawings, his pencil moving quickly across the paper. "That's a nice house, Liam," I said, trying to engage him. He didn't look up. "It's where I live," he replied in a flat voice. "Who lives in the house with you?" I asked, hoping to draw him out a little. "Just me and Mom," he said, still focused on the drawing. I watched as he shaded in the window again, his hand pressing down so hard that the paper began to tear. Something about the intensity of his movements unsettled me. "Why do you always draw the window like that?" I asked gently. Liam paused, his pencil hovering over the page. He looked up at me for the first time, his dark eyes meeting mine. "Because that's where he is," he whispered. A chill ran down my spine. "Who's there, Liam?" He dropped his gaze back to the drawing and said nothing more. The other kids had already left, and I knew Liam's mother wouldn't be here for at least another half hour, so I decided to sit down next to him and see if I could get him to talk. "Liam," I said softly, "if there's something you want to tell me, you can. I'm here to listen." He chewed on his bottom lip, his eyes darting around the room as if he was afraid someone might overhear us. Finally, he leaned in close and said, "He told me not to tell." "Who told you that?" I asked, keeping my voice calm and steady. "The man," he whispered, his voice trembling. "The man in the drawer." I felt a cold sweat break out on my forehead. "What drawer, Liam?" He pointed to the window in his drawing. "The one in the room behind the window. He hides there, and he watches me. He told me if I say anything, he'll hurt my mom." My heart pounded in my chest. I had no idea what to say. I didn't want to scare him, but I couldn't just brush this off as a child's imagination. There was something in Liam's eyes, a look of genuine fear that I couldn't ignore. "Liam," I said carefully, "does your mom know about the man?" He shook his head quickly. "No, she doesn't believe me. She says it's just a bad dream, but it's not. He's real." I swallowed hard, trying to process what he was telling me. "Have you seen this man before?" "Only at night," he whispered. "When it's dark, he comes out of the drawer and he watches me." I didn't know what to do. This was far beyond anything I was trained to handle. But I knew one thing. I couldn't let Liam go home without doing something. I needed to talk to his mother, to find out what was really going on in that house. When Liam's mother finally arrived, I pulled her aside and told her what Liam had said. Her face went pale, and for a moment, I thought she might break down right there in the hallway. But she quickly composed herself and forced a smile, brushing off Liam's story as nothing more than a product of an overactive imagination. "Liam's always been a bit of a dreamer," she said, her voice tight. "He gets that from his father." I nodded, but I could tell she was hiding something. Her eyes kept flicking toward Liam, who was standing a few feet away, clutching his drawing in his hands. "Is everything okay at home?" I asked, trying to sound as non-confrontational as possible. She gave a quick nod, too quick. "Everything's fine. Really, it's just us. Liam's father, he's not in the picture anymore, and sometimes Liam has a hard time with that." I wanted to press her further, but I could see she was getting defensive. And without any concrete evidence, there wasn't much more I could do. I watched as she took Liam's hand and led him out of the school, his drawing crumpled in her other hand. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about Liam's words, the man in the drawer. I tossed and turned, my mind racing with possibilities. Was it really just a figment of his imagination, or was there something more sinister at play? The next day, I went to the principal and shared my concerns. We agreed to report the situation to Child Protective Services, just in case. It was all we could do. A few days later, I learned that CPS had visited Liam's home. They found nothing unusual, no man, no hidden room, just a stressed-out single mother and a boy with too much imagination. They closed the case, and life went on. But I knew something wasn't right. Liam stopped coming to the after-school program after that. His mother said she found other arrangements, but I never saw either of them again. It was as if they had disappeared. I still think about Liam and those drawings. I wonder if he was ever safe, if he ever got away from whatever or whoever was haunting him. I wonder if I did enough. And sometimes late at night, I wonder if that man was real, and if so, where he is now. All I have left are the memories and a deep sense of unease that I can't shake. Because in the end, Liam was just a child, drawing the only truth he knew, and I was the one who failed to see the danger hidden within those simple lines on paper.